I'm Rachel.
And I'm Lauren.
Welcome back to Capital Conversations with Rachel and Lauren.
This week we'll be talking about DHS negotiations and the Clintons' pending testimony on Capitol Hill. After that, we'll answer all of your questions about our lives on the Hill.
Welcome back, everybody. With government funding happening, and we keep always talking about that, it's maybe going to end, maybe it's not going to end. We are sad to report that it is still not over.
So close, though.
We're very
close. We have 11 of the 12 appropriations bills passed. Not saying that that last one is not important. It is going to be the hardest of all of the funding bills. It's the Department of Homeland Security, but as we talked about last week, so much more falls under that. You look at FEMA for disaster aid or the Coast Guard. There's just so many things that are affected that are not ICE, and that's what most people are thinking about right now with the news in Minneapolis and across Minnesota and the rest of the country.
And right now, what I think a lot of people are wondering is where do we go from here? Because Democrats have certain demands. They want body cameras on officers. They want them to be unmasked. They want judicial warrants. They want commitments that they're not going to deport or detain American citizens. And we've already seen Republicans, we've seen House Speaker Mike Johnson, already tank 2 of those 4 demands. He said last week, judicial warrants are not going to work. They're just, I even forget the word that he used, but it's an unworkable, I think is what he said, arrangement, because it would just make deporting and catching illegal immigrants take so much longer than what is happening right now. But I think a lot of Democrats want to see that in order to pause and delay some of those proceedings, because sometimes they are targeting American citizens, and that's what we've seen in Minneapolis.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of the Democrats' argument comes from the fact that they are going into people's homes or are going into private businesses, and they're saying that that's unconstitutional. They have a constitutional right to not allow them to enter without a warrant. And so that's kind of going to be that argument we've seen there. We see one of the negotiations that Democrats want is law enforcement or federal law enforcement to not be able to go into hospitals or schools or areas that were considered safe prior to the Trump administration that ICE really couldn't go in. And so I think that that also is somewhat of a non-starter for Republicans. They've been pretty supportive of the president and that. And so we don't know where negotiations stand or where they're going to go, and neither do the members. We have talked to members, and we've pried and kind of tried to see where this lands, and they have no idea. It's not one of those things where they're saying one thing, but then they have this concept of a plan that they're going to get to. They're in as much of a loss as us and anyone across the country at where these negotiations are going to land or what the outcome is going to be. Because Democrats have said they're not going to vote for a year-long continuing resolution just to keep funding levels the same for just DHS. Jeffries, or House Minority Leader Jeffries, has said that's not a starter. Rosa DeLauro has also said that she's not going to vote for that. So I don't know where things would land.
I don't know, and I think also Republicans are a bit more, I guess I don't know what the word, they're more realistic about what is going to happen on Friday, because Friday is the deadline, and so that's when, they're supposed to have some sort of deal, either a full year bill, or it's going to be a spending deal. Mm-hmm. And Tom Cole, who is a top Republican on appropriations for the House, he said during one of his speeches before the Rules Committee when they were debating this bill and seeing if it was even going to make it to the floor, he said, I am not going to be surprised if after the 10 days we're going to be back here again with another CR. Because I think the issue, and Republicans have admitted it, and the more negotiable Republicans have said they understand that this is a political issue for Democrats. The Democrats and their base really want to see reforms when it comes to DHS and ICE. And so Republicans on the appropriations side understand that. They are sympathetic to the fact that their Democratic colleagues like Rosa DeLauro is getting pressure from Jeffries and other leadership and progressives and even centrists who are wanting to see some sort of power and restrictions on immigration agencies. And even though DeLauro has expressed frustration that the Senate didn't pass the DHS bill and sent it back, she's understanding that this is an issue that Democrats can't really fall flat on. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like what we had talked about with healthcare. Healthcare was such a big issue for them in the last shutdown. And at the end of it, Democrats really didn't get anything out of it. And as you had heard from Representative McKenzie last week, if you watched that episode, ACA talks are kind of stalled right now. They're almost dead in the water, and that's going to be a problem for centrist House Republicans who really put their jobs on the line to vote for that bill. And so not only did they not really get much out of it, Democrats really didn't get much out of that shutdown, and neither did Republicans. Nobody won.
Nobody won that.
Nobody won that one. So that's the problem, is that with this shutdown that just happened, I think that was more of a signal and a test that we could be seeing a longer shutdown. And Jeffries hasn't said that a shutdown is on the table. Like, nobody's saying that.
Yeah.
But in his statement, he has said, anything that doesn't give us complete restructure to DHS and ICE is a non-starter for Democrats. So at that point, what do? Johnson has a 1-seat majority right now, and people are already mad about the bill, and they were mad about it last week over the SAVE Act.
Yeah. I think that it will make a big difference in, every day-to-day, the happenings of ICE across the country, whether it be Texas or Minnesota, it is so touch and go that I think that if anything happens or anything unfolds within the next week, any drop of a pen could unravel any form of negotiations. Like we saw after the shooting of Alex Preddy, that's when some more moderate Republicans came to the table. Some called on Kristi Noem to step down, like we talked about last week, or some problem solvers Republicans came out and wanted some immigration reforms. And so I think that it is just really, if anything happens over the next week that kind of changes negotiations, that will also be a major, negotiation not tactic, obviously, because these things are happening in real time and people care about them, but that will affect negotiations drastically.
Had said last week that with the shooting of Renee Good, it was mainly partisan responses. Democrats were really upset. Republicans were like, that's what happens when you get involved with immigration and impede immigration officers. But then, as you said, with Alex Preddy, that opened the doors for a lot of things. And so I think you're seeing a lot of people more willing to negotiate and get those restrictions on ICE. The one thing that I think is going to also block Republicans operating in good faith is the SAVE Act. And a lot of people don't really know what that is, but it's basically a voter ID, proof of citizenship bill where you have to have those two things in order to register to vote. And Republicans use it because they really want it, and it's passed the House twice, because they don't want illegal immigrants voting in elections.
They really want it.
They really want this bill.
Really want it.
And it is noteworthy that illegal immigrants already are not allowed, like non-citizens, let's just make it more broadly, non-citizens are not allowed to vote in elections. That's already the law of the land. But this would impose a nationwide proof of citizenship, proof of voter ID, because not all states do that. And so that's why Republicans really want to crack down on it, because what happened with 2020 and then what happened with 2024. When we see the 2026 elections, if there's any hint of illegal voter fraud, Republicans are going to go crazy. So they were really pushing for this bill. But the problem with that is that House Republicans are very cognizant that this bill is not going to pass without getting attached to something else, because, as we've talked about a million times, the Senate filibuster. That totally impedes the way that anything can get passed nowadays.
Yeah. And I think that there are very loud Republicans who are not willing to negotiate on the SAVE Act, just like there are Democrats that are not willing to negotiate on any of these DHS reforms. And it is just going to be so hard to make these meet in the middle. Johnson has a 1-seat majority now that Christian Menefee has been sworn in, and that changes a lot. That is one singular vote, and Thomas Massie is almost always a no on funding votes. And so that is a no vote margin after that.
And going off of that, when it comes to the SAVE Act, I think that another problem that they're going to face with these DHS negotiations is that House conservatives are really going to be pushing that if there is another CR on this DHS bill, they're going to want to have the SAVE Act attached to it. Or if they can't get a CR, because I don't think you would even get you wouldn't get Democrats to vote for a CR on a good day. Imagine getting the SAVE Act also attached to that. I don't think that's going to go. So the other option was that they want to try to do this standing or talking filibuster, which I had to look up because I didn't realize that the 60-vote filibuster that we talk about all the time, that is the more modern version of it. In the olden days, what they would do is basically you filibustered because you actually had to filibuster. You had to stand up there and talk the whole time, and while you were talking, nothing could get voted on until you stopped talking and enough people ran out of things to say, and then you moved forward and voted, and then it would be a simple majority. It wouldn't be that 60-vote threshold. But they haven't done that in a very long time, and a lot of older establishment Republicans, even conservative Republicans in the Senate, have said we are weary about and wary of deciding to get rid of the 60-vote filibuster and use this talking filibuster, because then at some point Democrats are going to come back into power. It's how it works. It just goes back and forth. They're going to then have precedent to use this, and we're going to be mad about that.
Yeah.
And so I think that is another thing too, is that as much as I think Republicans all want this SAVE Act, the Senate is a lot more cognizant of that. They have such a harder job to do. And I think House members love to posture and post on X and social media and blast about all the things that they're doing. But at the end of the day, like, they have to understand that the Senate has it harder. And so, I mean, unless you have a 20-seat majority in the House and like 80 votes in the Senate, you're kind of stuck.
And I mean, Republicans have been staunch supporters of the filibuster for a long time. It's more Democrats that do call on abolishing the filibuster. It's much more of a Democratic take on Senate procedure. And even Trump has called on abolishing the filibuster on a number of things, or asking Thune to get rid of it for certain bills. And Senate Majority Leader Thune has stood pretty firm on not getting rid of it till now. Like, that is something that it's like, once the precedent is broken, that opens a door for anything to happen. We've talked about that with President Trump using really strong executive powers, and that if a Democratic comes into office in 2028, if somebody wins, Republicans are not going to want them to use as much executive power that President Trump is using, similar to the Senate with the filibuster. If they do bypass the filibuster for this standing filibuster and pass it under a simple majority, that opens the door for whenever Democrats gain control to do that whenever they want. It kind of just, it really opens the floodgates to become very partisan in a chamber that is meant to be more bipartisan than the House.
And also, I think that what was notable about last week is that the House was able to pass the CR because a few conservatives said that they got confirmation that there was going to be a change to the filibuster in the Senate. But then when actually those conversations came to light and people were talking to senators, those senators who were allegedly involved in these conversations were kind of like, that's not what we said. So it was definitely almost like a game of telephone, except they were all in the same room. So I'm not sure how something was miscommunicated, but House conservatives were very much like, we got a promise, it's going to happen. And Senate people were like, were you in the same room that we were? Because that is not what was happening. So I think that House Republicans think that by putting the pressure on the Senate, it's going to get the SAVE Act done faster. But I think, as you said, you made a good point. Thune has been very good about standing his ground. And he is not going to go into something knowing that it's going to fail. And he's not going to go through this unnecessary effort to put the SAVE Act up knowing that Democrats are not going to vote for it. You might see some Democrats like Fetterman, he likes to vote with Republicans a lot, a couple of the Nevada senators, but I think a majority of, you won't see as many of the conservative Senate Democrats join on the SAVE Act as you do for like spending deals. So totally. I think that it just kind of puts everybody in a really uncomfortable position, because these negotiations are kind of going nowhere. And as much as they're putting out plans and they're having, kind of like you said, a concept of a plan, like, they're doing all of these things, but I don't necessarily see them coming to fruition by Friday. I just don't think that you can get a comprehensive bill, especially if you want to do it right, because that's another thing too, is that Democrats have said, we don't want reform for reform's sake. Republicans, to their credit, have said, we're going to work with you on that, but like, we need to have time to do that. So I think it will be very interesting this week to see how close they get to a deal, and if we're going to have another 10-day CR, if it's going to be 2 weeks, or if they're going to try to do a full year. But again, as you said, I don't think Democrats are going to go for that.
Well, we will have a lot to follow this week and a lot to come back for y'all next week, but we're going to move straight into our question and answer portion, our favorite part. And we have a question, and it is, has a former president ever testified before Congress?
Okay, so yes, and I'm pulling this up on my phone here because I want to make sure that I'm accurate. So to give some context to the question, we have former President Bill Clinton and former Secretary of State / First Lady Hillary Clinton coming to testify before Congress at the end of February. And that is a big deal. There was a lot of back and forth, and it wasn't so sure that they were going to come, and then there was going to be votes to hold them in contempt and whatnot. And so when we were doing these stories and we were talking about the fact that they are going to come and testify on Capitol Hill, we were wondering, when has a president ever done that? And so I looked it up. The last time that a president testified before Congress was Gerald Ford in 1983. He testified before a House subcommittee regarding his pardon of Richard Nixon. So no president in recent history, I guess you could say, has done this before. So this is kind of a big deal. And you had said something interesting, that this stuff with like executive orders and whatnot like opens the floodgates. This opens the floodgates also because now this has set a precedent. Republicans have. They've gone after a former president, and a lot of former presidents, they're able to have presidential authority, and or presidential immunity is what they're called. And, they don't waive it very often because that's the power that you get by being a president or former president. And so the fact that Republicans did this, now this opens the opportunity for Democrats to do the same thing to President Trump. And they had done this with the January 6th committee. They had done it, when they had the House. Like they've tried to get Trump in front of a committee. It's never worked. And I think a lot of people are not going to be surprised if Democrats try to go after Trump again. It's just kind of like, that's what honestly Republicans' easiest messaging card is like, oh, Democrats just want power so they can go after Trump again. But the problem is that they did set a precedent here where if a former president can come and testify and you're forcing them to do so, Democrats are like, well, then we have the power to subpoena Trump when he's out of office or even when he's in office.
I mean, a similar thing also happened with whenever all of the Biden auto pin stuff was happening. They subpoenaed a lot of people that worked at the White House. And whenever you work at the White House, you have different protections than you do working in Congress or working in the judicial. You have executive privilege, which essentially allows you to withhold information in a deposition or testimony because it is like classified, or you just like there's reasons where you wouldn't share it or it wouldn't be released to the public. But they waived that executive privilege during Biden autopin. And so there's been some change in how that's been in oversight. And I think that this one will be very interesting. I do think Democrats will be calling President Trump in if they flip the majority, whenever he's not president anymore. But I do think it changes the norms within the Oversight Committee. They also, speaking of changing norms, they moved forward in a contempt resolution, which we talked about a few weeks back. They moved it out of committee and they moved it forward to the Rules Committee, which was the next step to advance it, which that's another thing that usually former presidents are not held in contempt of Congress. And so that one was going to be pretty big until they did eventually agree to testify. I do think it was pretty strategic. They agreed to testify while the Rules Committee was hearing the contempt resolutions, which was definitely a last-minute deal.
Such a House behavior.
Such a House behavior. They did say in their original letter to Chairman Comer, whenever they essentially didn't show up for their depositions, that they wanted to use as much time of Republicans' time in the majority as possible to kind of waste that time, was essentially what they were saying.
That's kind of funny.
And they kind of did do that. They waited till the last minute whenever it was in Rules Committee. They used up time in Rules whenever we were getting appropriations bills across the floor. They waited until right up to the noon deadline to agree to the terms and conditions. So we will be hearing from them. It will be a closed-door testimony, but it is going to be videoed. So we will get that video at some point in time after the investigation.
That next episode then that we do after that, we will definitely be talking about it at length because there's going to be a lot to uncover there.
I don't know if we said this. This is on the investigation into Jeffrey Epstein. I'm not sure if we said
I
that
don't know
explicitly.
if we included that part, but yes, it is on Jeffrey.
It is on obviously the Epstein files, and so I think it'll be interesting. I think the Clintons are extremely strategic. I think that they are obviously smart. That was the President of the United States and a Secretary of State, so I think that it'll be a very interesting testimony.
I think to also quick note before we wrap is that when Democrats decided to vote in committee, a lot of Democrats voted in committee to hold former President Bill Clinton in contempt of Congress. Less voted to hold Hillary in contempt, but some still did. So this is a bipartisan effort. And that contempt, I don't know if that contempt resolution on the floor would have gotten bipartisan support.
I think it would have.
I think that the people who voted in committee would probably vote for it on the floor.
I think in more.
I think more, especially for Bill Clinton. If they had done so, I don't know how much Hillary Clinton's would have gotten. I think it definitely would have been less. But the point that I'm trying to make is that it is a bipartisan effort. So a lot of this Jeffrey Epstein stuff, and we talked about this before, is bipartisan. And it is, you saw with like Marjorie Taylor Greene coming out and joining Democrats in ways that she hadn't before on this issue. So this circles back to also Democrats saying that this will give them advantage to call in Trump, because in their mind they're like, well, this is bipartisan effort, and if you as Republicans want to see our party's former president come in, we should have the same right as well. And I think that Republicans, and especially James Comer as the oversight chair, is going to have a very hard time getting out of that one.
Yeah. Well, I'll be very interested to see former President Bill Clinton's testimony. I don't think that Hillary's will be as intriguing. She had no public run-ins with Jeffrey Epstein. her ties were pretty few and far in between and a little bit far off. So I do see why that got less votes on the bipartisan vote in committee and probably would have gotten less on the floor, just given the nature of the situation and the run-ins and their mentions in the files. But we will be watching all of that and DHS negotiations. But that's a wrap. Thanks for watching Capital Conversations with Rachel and Lauren.
And as always, make sure to like and subscribe, to read our stories, and read at WashingtonExaminer.com.